Hi everybody, welcome to the Attract Capital webinars. I'm Janine. I'm sitting with David, CEO of Attract
Hello,
Capital.
everyone.
Today we're going to be talking about the art of raising stretch and gap funding. So David, can you start us with what that is?
Well, stretch and gap funding, Janine, is the hard to fund portion of your capital budget. So let's say you're raising 10 million and you have 8 million raised, you have a 2 million gap, or you have a 2 million stretch piece. And you really need that. So even though it's a small piece of the overall capital budget, it plays an outsized role in you being able to close your deal.
Gaps. We don't want any gaps in our deals. So why would it then be important to focus on the stretch and the closing the gap funding?
Because without the right amount of gap funding, you can't close your deal and you can't do all the great things you want to do with the company after you acquire it. You don't have enough money for the transition costs. You don't have enough money for the integration. And without all the without the gap funding as part of the capital budget, it makes the overall deal much riskier. And the problem with making the deal riskier is that usually means is that you're kind of pushing off into the future without having the right amount of capital beneath you, which means that it can pose liquidity risks for your business. So making sure that you've got all the money you need when you embark on an acquisition is critical, and eliminating that gap and really just getting rid of it, because usually if you go into a deal with a gap, it's risky, and so you almost want to go into a deal with the opposite of a gap. You want to go in having overfunding the deal where you have more capital on hand than you really anticipated having.
So you want to be fully supported going into these deals.
You want to be absolutely fully supported from a financial standpoint. It's almost like having to make a monthly budget, or having to, if you own a home and you have to pay the utilities and pay your mortgage, and it's almost trying to get through the month without having the right amount of money, and it's just not a prudent thing for an acquirer to do, which is why it's important.
Sounds like a good approach. So saying that, how would you then be, like, what's the most mindful way to go about that?
Well, one of the principles that we use at Attract Capital is to make sure that you're overfunding your deal, that everything takes longer than you think it will, and it usually costs more than you think it will. There's always unforeseen expenditures. So over budget the amount of capital you need to get your deal done. And you also want to make sure that you're not just raising money to buy a company. So you want to make sure that you're not only over budgeting, but that you're making sure that you're getting more money in your budget for working capital and for transition costs, because you're not buying a business just for it to be static. You're buying a business to invest in it and to grow it, because you want to make more money on the other side 3 or 4 years down the road. You're only going to do that if you have an adequate amount of growth capital.
So if you could say that Attract Capital had 4 key tips to be more mindful with this stretch and gap funding, what would those 4 tips be?
Absolutely, Janine. That's a great segue. It's always boiled down to 4 or 5 tips. So the first tip is you want to prioritize the hard to raise capital first. So you want to make sure that you're spending the most amount of time on the front end of your capital raising process focused on the gap, as opposed to focusing on the easier to raise part of the financing, which is a bank loan, and then having this nagging gap or stretch piece at the end. So you kind of want to invert it and flip it.
Get the hard stuff out of the way.
Exactly. So focus on the gap first. Make that a priority in your process. Number 2 is you want to look at your capital requirement in a more holistic way. You want to structure the capital you need on a cash flow basis, not just an asset basis, but on a cash flow basis. When you look at it on a cash flow basis, it unlocks much larger amounts of capital for your deal. So you really need to look at it that way, because the goal of raising capital is never to have a gap.
Yeah.
So if you focus on cash flow financing as opposed to asset-based financing, it'll give you more money than you need, and it'll eliminate the gap. So that's the ultra tip. The number 2 is the most important
thing. And why
thing.
wouldn't you want that when you're trying to get this going? So.
Absolutely, Janine. You don't want to have a gap. A gap is sort of an unfortunate consequence of a process that wasn't set up the right way in the first place. Number 3 is, once you find your gap funding, that gap funding is very valuable. You want to use as much of it as you can. You want to increase the amount of gap funding that you have in your deal structure, in your capital stack, because it's really more like equity capital, and equity capital has a lot more value to you growing your business over the long term. And number 4 is something we talked about a little earlier, which is overfunding your gap. Look at your deal and say, if you need 10 million, well, raise 11 or 12 million. If you need 15 million, raise 17 or 18 million. Overfund your deal so that, or overfund your gap so that you have more than enough money to take you from point A to point B, because getting to point B is really what it's all about.
That's the goal. You want to be gapless through all of that. So.
Perfectly said, Janine. You want to be gapless when raising capital. And when you work with Attract Capital, I'd like to think that we help you crush the gap.
Yes,
so that
crushing the gap.
You don't have a gap.
100%. So there you have it. You want to be gapless? Attract Capital. David is your man. Otherwise, take these tips and learn how to do the stretching and get through that gap. And Attract Capital is always here to help you. I think that's all we have today, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Have a good one, everyone.